Citizens of the world, welcome back to another Keep Yours podcast where we try and help you through this crazy system of capitalism and keep a few more dollars in your pocket. Today, I want to return to talking about capitalism, economics, and free markets and why they're important and the difference between our system and other systems. And also, not just the good things about it, but potentially the bad things as well. But I think it's important in this, as we move into the next political cycle of politicians promising changes and what they're promising to change and how that might impact us, and return to some fundamentals of what we all should know about free markets and what the alternative is and why free markets are really good for all of us and why they really help us. So we could start out real simple with just asking the question of what is a free market? And at its very base level, a free market is an economic system where transactions and prices are determined by individuals and privately owned companies instead of governments. And a free market says that I can do what I want to do and you can do what you want to do. Government doesn't tell us what we can and cannot do. And that doesn't mean that our government hasn't violated these free market principles over and over and over again in terms of me being able to do what I want to do. Well, that was true in my youth because there was no draft. But if you were coming of age in the 60s and 70s, you could be sent off to war without an option. That's not really a free market. A free market says that only those who want to go and the government would have to pay them to go. Now that may also clash with what we view as being patriotic, but so is fighting a war in Vietnam for no reason. So you have conflicting issues all of the time in free markets. And in a free market, it begins with freedom of speech, freedom to say what you want to say. And we have that in this country. You don't have that in other countries. In China, for example, talk out about Hong Kong right now. Talk about how Hong Kong should be free in China and see if you don't end up in jail and beaten very, very quickly. I mean, they're mad at people in the US for saying that freedom is a good thing in Hong Kong or anywhere in the world for that matter. And if you're a Muslim in China, you could be thrown into a detention camp next week, which is horrible. Let's not pretend like we didn't do that in America as well at some point, because we have. We've done worse. However, free markets and free society go together. And if we lose our free markets, we will lose our freedom to choose. So how does a free market really work? Like, what's the underlying thing that makes a free market work? And the fundamental thing is that the resources, whether that's your labor is a resource, or things that come out of the ground or are grown in the ground, what you choose to plant as a farmer, you get to choose. You're not told what you have to plant because these things are owned by people and not governments. The foundation of a free market is personal property, meaning the difference is you own the property and not the government. Because if the government owns the property, then it can tell you what to do. It can take it from you at any time. It can decide what the price of what you produce is, and it can decide that you no longer own it. So back in the day, not too long ago, if you grew up in the Roman Empire and you were a Roman citizen, you might have rights to property. If you were not a Roman citizen, you had no rights. Wasn't very long ago, and in fact, we still have kings and queens. Saudi Arabia is a perfect example. It's basically run by a king. And that king has just put his son in charge. And if you think it's a free market in Saudi Arabia, then you can ask all of the people who the new king, or king-to-be, rounded up and I'll say imprisoned, but it's a loosely term because he put them all in the Ritz. And they basically turned the Ritz into a prison for very rich people until those rich people decided they were going to give the government what it wanted, a big chunk of what they had, so that the government could use that money as it see fit. All of the oil in Saudi Arabia owned by the government. So if you're a landowner and you're currently getting money from a gas company that's pulling money out of a well on your land, in communist countries, they just take it. It's not your oil. And in fact, it's not your land. So they'll just take that too. Free market says that if you're going to take that land from me, you got to pay me a fair market value for it. And I'm not saying that always happens here. Don't get this confused. I'm talking about what a free market is, not how it's been deployed. And that's actually usually the difference. And I think that's important right now because as we talk through the next cycle of political issues and what people are promising, many people are promising to reduce and eliminate many of our free market principles. And that's problematic because, again, it goes down to our basic freedoms. So I want people to be able to differentiate between free markets and capitalism and crony capitalism, where too much money has been injected into the system. And I'll try and talk about all those things as we go through here. So personal property is the foundation. And if we can each individually own our labor and be paid for that and choose what rates we want to be paid for that. Now, government stepped in that regard as well. So if I wanted to learn from you and I was 14, I could come and offer my services for free and say, hey, the value that you're providing me in teaching me is more than I can afford to pay you. And if you're willing to let me work for free, then I'll work for free just to learn. And we allow this to a large degree in our education system. And in fact, we do even way more than that. We'll allow you to go into massive amounts of debt and pay a lot of money to somebody to teach you things, without a guarantee that any of those teachings are going to be worthwhile later in your life and you're going to be able to make money from them. However, it's illegal for me as the 14-year-old to come work for you for free. We have this thing called a minimum wage law. And so that distorts a free market in which I'm free to work for you for free if I choose, because I feel like I might be learning something. Now, there's some ways around that if it's family owned, and there's other ways around it of usually just not telling anybody. But in large part, having minimum wages can prevent some people from getting opportunities. And that's not to say that I don't support a living wage. I absolutely do. But I also support opportunities for people. And sometimes people are not given opportunities because if the minimum wage is $15 an hour and you're 14 years old, you're not worth $15 an hour. And why is it that when you're 19, 20, 21, you will pay tens of thousands of dollars a year for somebody to teach you something, but the year after you graduate and get a diploma and you go to work for somebody who's actually going to give you a paycheck, you aren't paying them anymore to teach you, and they're going to teach you even more than you got taught in school. I promise you, you will learn more after school than in school. So let's continue this discussion of free market principles. So why are free markets super important? Well, I've already discussed freedom of speech. But if you trust Albert Einstein, he said free markets, they're not a virtue. They're a necessary condition for a creative society. And the reason for this is incentives. I have an incentive to use my ability and my resources and my private property to improve the lives of others such that they want to buy my products and I make more money from them. I can choose to pursue whatever I want to pursue with my time and money. And that doesn't mean that it has to be beneficial to society whatsoever. However, there's a good incentive to do so because I would get the rewards of that. Let's use Jeff Bezos and Amazon, for example. So a little over 20 years ago, Jeff Bezos looks at the internet and he says, hey, here's an opportunity. I don't think everyone really wants to go to the bookstore every time they want to buy a book. What if we created a place where we just used a big warehouse in a place that's cheap to build warehouses, and because of that, we had much lower cost of operating, and therefore we could offer books at a lower price, and we'll just ship them to people and they'll show up on their doorstep a couple days later. And even though we have to pay for shipping, because we'll save so much in salaries from not having people working at the store, as well as not having to pay the rent, I think we could make money selling people books and reduce the cost that they pay for the books. So that's good for the consumer because they pay less. It's good for the consumer because they don't have to get in their car and drive to the bookstore and walk through all the aisles to find the books and wait in line to check out and drive home. So we're providing them a lower cost, a reduction of the amount of things that they have to do to obtain that lower cost. I think that's a good market. So Jeff Bezos creates Amazon out of his parents' garage. And the next thing you know, all of us agree with Jeff Bezos. We didn't have to. We could have all done the exact opposite. All the citizens of the United States and of the world as he expanded could have said, you know what, Jeff? That's a nice idea. But I like going to the bookstore. I like sifting through the lanes and lanes of books while I try and find the one that I'm looking for. It introduces me to new titles. I look at different authors. I can read half the book in the bookstore without buying it. I like going to the bookstore and having coffee there and talking to other people who read. I don't like your product and service. I want the bookstore product and service. Could have been the decision of Americans, but obviously it wasn't. Obviously, we all enjoy our time a little, well, as much as Jeff Bezos thought we would. And we also like lower prices as much as Jeff Bezos thought we would. And in fact, now with Amazon, it is such a huge value proposition that I believe Jeff Bezos should be the richest person in the world, because when it comes to saving us time, Jeff Bezos has done the best job. Every time I order something from Amazon now, all I think about is, before, I would have had to go get in my car, find the store that sold the particular thing that I'm looking for, go to that store, find it in the store, stand in line to check out, and then get in my car and drive back home. That's a lot of time that Jeff Bezos has saved me. Delivery is an amazing thing. It shows up on my doorstep, and now it's getting even crazier. Within a day, sometimes, same day, it shows up on my doorstep. And it's cheaper? Seems almost impossible. So Jeff Bezos should be rewarded for that because he saved us time and money. Now, if we lived in a communist society, Jeff Bezos wouldn't have been free to start that business. If Russia does not want an Amazon, Russia decides it doesn't get an Amazon. Period. There's no one else to consult. Vladimir Putin makes the decision. In China, Xi makes the decision. Yes or no to Amazon. Oh, they're going to say no to Amazon and in fact put up barriers. Why? Because they want their own Amazon. Alibaba. And trust me, any information that Alibaba's got all goes to the government. Alibaba can only get loans if the Chinese government says they can get loans. Supposedly now it's floated as a free market as they've introduced some forms of capitalism, but it's not a free market there. Don't ever confuse yourself and believe that it is. It's not, because at any time, the government there could decide this is bad for the citizens and therefore killed. They did a couple years ago with video games. And that's not to say that video games aren't all good, that everything that they do isn't good, because there are addictive properties to them and they are making some people go bankrupt because they're spending money on these free games. But China saw an addiction, and can be a good thing if you have a magnanimous leader who makes excellent decisions all the time, then communism sounds like a good idea. The problem is we don't know who's going to make good decisions or bad ones. But they decided that no more video games could be sold in China until they figured out the controls that they wanted and literally stopped the market entirely. It became illegal to produce a new video game. Literally overnight. By decree. In America, you can't do that because we have freedoms and we have rights. So if the government wants to institute something like that, it's going to get challenged in court. Does the government even have the right to do that? And it'll be challenged in court. And in the meantime, we all continue as is. So free markets align the incentives. The incentive for Jeff Bezos and the incentive for me, the consumer. Jeff Bezos believes that he can save me time. I agree with him. He saves me time. Every time he does that, he gets a little transfer of wealth. Hey, Jeff, thanks for saving me an hour by not making me go to Target or Walmart. Here's a penny. Oh, wait, you saved me money as well on the purchase. Here's another penny. And he does that millions of times a day. And now he's a billionaire, as he should be, because he's provided something to the world that saved it a ton of time and money. If you want another example, Bill Gates is a good one. Bill Gates developed software that made people extremely productive. It used to be you needed an army of people typing to send out letters to all of your customers. Now, you can not only send out all the letters to them, you can email them to them, and you don't even have to spend the money on postage. Not good for the U.S. Postal Service. Really good for the rest of us and not spending extra money that we don't need to spend. And not having to have an army of secretaries on typewriters because a computer can do the job. So when we all get more done, there's less people we have to hire. Bill Gates and Microsoft get a little piece of that increase in productivity. And those little pieces, when you do it on scale, add up over time. So he's a billionaire because he deserves to be. Now, some people are rich because it's old money. But capitalism and new money is not the problem. Because as you've seen with new money with Bill Gates, look what he's doing now. He's trying to cure diseases across the world. And that's, again, only allowed because of free markets. So he was allowed to grow his company because of a free market, and that improved all of our lives and productivity. Same with Jeff Bezos. Now we don't all have to go to the store every time we want something. And if you're a parent with children, not having to go to the store or just being able to pick your purchase up and not have to walk through the store with children, oh, that's a huge value. That's a huge value. All the parents that I know tell me this all the time. They go, this is one of the greatest inventions ever for us as parents. No tantrums in the store. No screaming about I want because I see it in front of me. Nope. Keep that all behind the scenes now. No standing in line and waiting anymore. Nope, get your time back. Picking up your groceries takes minutes instead of hours per week. So all of those things have incentives on both sides. Incentives for somebody to try and figure out something that makes everyone's life better. An incentive for the consumer to decide whether or not he likes that incentive. Again, if you like going to the store, no one's stopping you. You want to go to the mall because you like the mall atmosphere and like shopping that way? Go do it. No one's saying you can't. But the consumer gets to decide. And the citizen gets to decide if they want to try and make something for the consumer that they think is better. But we all don't have to get shoved down our throat what we don't want. We don't have to go through the process we don't want to go through. We don't have to buy something because it's the only one available. That's the advantage of free markets. That's why they're important. It also goes to free speech. Now, here's one thing I do want to mention. Just because it's a free market does not make it the most efficient. It doesn't mean you can't have high productivity inside of another market. For example, Germany was very, very productive at building machines for war. In fact, they figured out how to use slaves in the process, which is hard for me to understand because if you're a slave and you know you're going to die working on some line, you have no motivation to increase your productivity or do any quality of work. And yet somehow the Germans figured out how to do this. And I'm sure It's not something we all want to talk about all the time. But I just want to mention that productivity is different than, freedom. So just because you're not free to be creative and do what you want to do does not mean you can't be productive. And there's certain of us people in the world who, even if we lived in a communist society, we're just going to work our asses off every day because that's what we do. I'm kind of one of those people. I'm going to work regardless. Whether there's a profit incentive or not, I'm one of the few who will work harder. But most people, if you said you need to show up 4 hours a day and get the same paycheck versus 8 hours a day, most people are not going to work the extra 4 hours a day out of their own volition. They're going to work what's required to get that money, and that's it. So let's go to the next question, which is, are markets in the U.S. considered free? And as the answer is to most things in life, especially when it comes to financial questions, the answer is it depends. And in this one, it depends on your perspective and it depends where you're at. So it's free for whom? Now, is the market in the U.S. free for me to compete with other U.S. companies? Many markets are comparatively free, and many others are not. And the reason for this is, there are many basically, but government intervenes all of the time. Companies intervene through government, and government makes laws that protect them. On a comparison basis, if we just compare it to other countries, our markets appear pretty free, but again, most of them have been tampered with. And so people are upset about capitalism, and that gets the blame, but what they should be upset about is governments allowing things and creating the rules that allow them to happen. So the first way that governments change freedom of free markets is tariffs. A tariff basically means that if you're not a U.S. company and you're making something that's going to be sold in the U.S., then we're going to charge a price on that to protect the company that's in the U.S. from your lower price. Effectively, that's that simple. That's what a tariff's for. It's to basically raise the price of the cost for you to sell it into the market here, which protects the local manufacturer from it. Now, we think that we don't have this, but as we'll explore later with cars, on the cars, we've got some freedoms. When it comes to trucks, a lot fewer freedoms. Taxation is another way. So companies get carved out loopholes for all sorts of different deductions. For example, you're required in the United States to put ethanol into gasoline. This is required for the people making gasoline, that 10% of that product contain ethanol. So if you have a factory that uses no ethanol, then you have to buy the credits from somebody else who's producing, let's say, twice as much as you, so that on balance, the entire market has 10% ethanol in gasoline. That is not good. That is not a free market. It is terrible. That is the government deciding that we should, A, grow corn to produce fuel, which is a ridiculous idea. And a few years ago, President of France flew over to the U.S. and he said, using corn for fuel is absolutely stupid. The flight that I took over here would require 100,000 acres of corn for that one flight. And I could be slightly off on some of those terms. It might not have been 100,000 acres. It might have been 10,000. In fact, I should probably look it up and clarify, but the point was well made that this is not a viable solution. And if you look at the distortion that does into a free market, so we're growing corn that wouldn't otherwise not be grown. That means we're spraying pesticides and using land for stuff that basically we don't need. And that's bad for all of us, except for if you're the farmer in Iowa or somewhere else that they grow a lot of corn. And then you think, well, why would they do that? Oh, I don't know. Maybe because all the farmers in Iowa got together and said, hey, if you would like us to vote for you, if you would like to be the next president and the primary start in Iowa, then we would like a handout. And that handout is we want corn to be required to be grown. And by required, we mean required to be included in gasoline. So we have ethanol plants that are useless in my mind, should not exist. I mean, when we talk about waste of energy, there is nothing more wasteful than turning corn, food, into fuel. Then we're required to put in gasoline, which actually is bad for all of our cars, which means they don't last as long. So from the consumer perspective, there's bad, bad, and bad all involved in this deal. But if you're the farmer in Iowa, it's good for you. So that's not a free market. That's government getting involved, creating laws to protect a particular interest, the farmer in Iowa, and it regulates everybody else, requiring them to not have a free market. I can't just sell you my gasoline and say, hey, here's my gasoline. It contains no ethanol. Nope. You're violation of federal law, as that's not a free market. So when we say, are our markets free? On a comparison basis, yes. But in reality, not really, only sort of. However, when you compare them to markets that are not free, they look really free. In China, if the government wants your info, if your company has technology that the government wants to deploy for, say, surveillance, which they are, then you're going to help them with that. In America, you don't have to do that. So Facebook sort of started all this facial recognition because they were very creative and got all of us to give them all of our pictures. And if you read the terms and conditions of your Facebook account for them to provide you a free service, any picture that you upload also becomes their property, which they can use for any purpose that they desire, including marketing. They can literally take a picture you post on Facebook, put it in a Facebook ad, you get nothing. But because everybody loaded up all these pictures and because everybody started doing their artificial intelligence, even though it's not really what people think it is, but basically you went in and tagged all your friends, that told Facebook who was who. That gave Facebook the analytics to then begin the facial recognition software. Well, this became and is being used globally. Now, that does not mean that our government and the NSA didn't hack into Facebook and steal that technology. It also doesn't mean that the government didn't buy it from Facebook. But a free market means that Facebook is not compelled to give the government that information. In China, you are. Because the government owns you and therefore owns all of your technology and controls your entire business if they decide they want to. So they can collect all the info they want on all their citizens. In America, the government's only supposed to collect the amount of information that's legal, which, of course, they pass laws like the Patriot Act, which is very unpatriotic when it comes to collecting information about citizens here. And as it turns out, pretty useless. Foreign companies have the same problems operating in other countries. So you already see in China, we all know that there's restriction on media. So there is no freedom of the press. There is no freedom of speech. And in fact, anything that promotes those is censored by the government. And therefore, if you're Apple operating in China, you have to restrict what the government tells you to restrict, or else they don't allow you to do business there. And it's that simple. It's not free. Same thing in other communist, fascist countries, Russia, Venezuela. The country owns all the oil. So if the country owns all the oil, that sounds nice in theory. And especially when Chavez came into Venezuela and he proposed this idea that the oil belongs to all of us. And when you're sitting on the world's largest oil reserves, to all of the citizens, that sounds like, hey, okay, it's all ours. We're going to get a paycheck for all of this. But what it really means is all of the profits are owned by the government, and the government gets to decide who gets those. And let's just say that usually doesn't trickle down to being everybody gets a fair, equal slice of the pie. Instead, it's those in charge take all of the pie and everybody else is left with nothing. And that's normally the case. I would venture to say that Vladimir Putin is the richest person in the world because he's collecting all of that Russian oil money all the time. And I'm pretty sure he pumps just enough back into the Russian economy to keep riots from happening where people are actually starving. But in Venezuela, people are literally starving. They now call it the charismo diet, where there's not enough food because the government has basically squandered the resources that are available when they took over all of the oil companies and all of the oil processing and everything else. They decided they were going to pay people who operated a lot less. So those people said, well, we're going to leave to go to a free market then because our services are required around the world, and I don't need to be in Venezuela to be in the oil business. I can go to Saudi Arabia or the United States or anywhere that they're pumping oil. And if those people will pay me more to drive a truck or run the factory for them or whatever job that they had, they left. And so you lose, because there's no incentive for people to learn anything, you lose the expertise that's required to efficiently produce that, efficiently to pull the oil out of the ground, to distribute it, to refine it. And Venezuela has slowly lost all of those things. And it's very sad for their citizens right now. And it's in a state of economic despair because everything's owned by the government. And therefore, all decisions are made by the government and all resources allocated according to the government. And you can see where the person in charge ends up with complete control over all of this, and citizens have no control. So the more things that our government controls, the less control we as citizens have over our government. And governments are not afraid to use their police state to enforce what they want to have happen, whether you like it or not. And if you happen to be one of the people who's on the government side, who's high up, you're probably taken care of. And you're okay with that. But if you're on the other side, you might get shot and killed. Vladimir Putin rarely has anybody run against him that's actually going to defeat him. Because if they're a legitimate contender, he'll just arrest them. Make some trumped up charges against them. There's no freedom in the courts. So you have no freedom. And that's why we want free markets, because free markets go to our basic freedoms. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press. And we don't want to lose those. So what are the big advantages of free markets? The first one is that the stocks are shelved with lots of options for us. Because the government's not telling a farmer what he has to grow. So a farmer can grow whatever crops he wants, which means that we can buy any of those crops. He's free to plant whatever he wants in his field, and therefore we get variety and we have options. We get to choose who we buy from. If we don't like something, and I say this about everything, like every time somebody complains, like if you want to complain about Starbucks, oh, Starbucks is terrible, they don't treat their people right, they buy coffee and it's not free trade, and they are forcing farmers to work for peasant wages, and they don't take care of their employees. And make no mistake, I don't believe necessarily any of this is true of Starbucks. I'm just using them as an example because they're a big company that everybody recognizes. But assume that all those things are true. You are not required to go to Starbucks because you live in a free society. There is competition, and therefore there are local coffee shops and there are other competitors. So you have freedom to choose where you spend your money. If we were in a communist country, it might just be only Starbucks. Or if you were in Russia, it might be, Russian brew, and that's all you get, and that's the only option. And the government owns all the stores, and they control the price, and they control the product. So you have no variety of product or less variety of product. Versus in America, you don't like the coffee roasting? You could go buy your own roaster, start your own roasting company. Happens all the time. So, and there's an incentive for people to do that because if they figure it out, they could sell it to other people. This is the biggest piece that I want everybody to know about capitalism and the advantage of a free market. You get the right to pursue what you want to do. You don't have to work for a particular company. You could choose to leave your job at any time. That's not true everywhere else. If you're unhappy in your job in America, you have the ability to do something about it. Most people in the world don't have that. And if they do, it's somewhat limited. But here, quit. If you're that unhappy with your job where all you do is bitch about it every day, then quit. Go learn a different skill or learn a new skill first, get another job, and then quit. But you have that opportunity. You're not stuck. We don't decide in the education system when you're in third or fourth grade that, you're going to be a mechanic or you're going to be an astronaut. Whatever it is, it's not defined for you. You have the freedom to pursue whatever you want, and you can change that up. You're not required to stay in the same job your whole life. You get trained as a plumber. You don't like plumbing anymore? Great. Go do something different. Learn to code. Learn to manage. If you don't want to turn the wrench anymore, you're not required to. You can go get an education and do whatever you want. That's the beauty of a free market. You get to decide what you want to do. Free markets reward those who improve our lives. Jeff Bezos improves my life every time I don't have to go to the store. Thanks, Jeff. That's what I think every time that I order something from Amazon and it shows up on my doorstep and I didn't do anything except for click buy, and it's usually a lower price than I would have got at the store that I had to go to, and I didn't have to go to the store. It shows up the next day. Thanks, Jeff. Appreciate that one, man. Thanks for saving me that time that I don't have to go drive, stand in line. Appreciate that. It's valuable service. Free markets reward. Rewards create incentives. That means people who have new creative ideas on how to do things and how to get things done. I mean, who would have thought any of us needed a phone that would search the internet? That was not on anyone's mind, period, when Apple came out with a smartphone. Steve Jobs had a vision that people could use this tool to access all sorts of information from anywhere on the planet. Everyone agreed with him and made Apple the most valuable company in the world. Unfortunately for Steve Jobs, he died before he got most of that benefit. But I'm sure for his family, that benefit will be huge. And for the rest of us, again, it's increased the productivity of our lives. That's not to say it doesn't have a downside with addiction and other problems that phones create. But the number of things that I'm able to do on my phone, just travel alone. The fact that I can either A, call for a ride immediately and have them know where I'm at and come pick me up specifically on the corner where I'm standing, or B, book a hotel room instantly. Have a map that shows me around everywhere I want to go so I don't have to have all this paper and all of these maps. It's saving us all tons of time and effort and energy. Valuable. And there's an incentive for that creation, and it's allowed. Instead of a group of people running a country deciding, do we want phones with internet search? Yes or no? And one guy makes that choice. In a free market, the market decides. We decide if we're going to buy that product or not. If we buy the product, it's successful. That guy makes money. If we don't, it's not. If we don't like the guy, we don't have to buy his product. It's not the only one available. Rewards create incentives. That's the key to the free market. That's exactly what Einstein was talking about. Private industry decides where to put money to work, not political decisions. This is hugely important. Governments don't make good decisions. They don't. I'm going to show you over and over and over why most of our problems are created by government. When private industry decides, then the market gets to decide. So the market just decided that WeWork is not a good business model. It is not worth billions of dollars. The only reason it's worth billions is because they put $10 billion into it, just SoftBank alone. Put $10 billion into it. Now it's worth $8 billion. $10 billion invested, worth $8 billion. Seems to be going the wrong way. But 3 weeks ago, they said it was worth $50 billion. But it's never made any money. That doesn't mean you're not allowed to try, but it does mean that all of us have the right to decide it's not worth anything and we don't have to buy any of it. We don't have to invest. We're not required to put our money into certain places. We have options. We have choice. And that's the last piece, that markets, free markets, determine prices, not governments. Every time governments determine prices, bad things happen. And that doesn't mean that governments don't need to step in from time to time and control bad behavior. They do. But governments being in charge of decisions, bad. Not everything in free markets is great, so we'll talk about the dark side of free markets. The first one that always comes to my mind is addiction. Companies have an incentive to get you addicted, and that's a simple incentive. They want you to buy more of their product. You don't buy more of the product if you don't use it. So how do we get them to use it? Oh, we get them addicted to it. So whether that's you being hooked on fat and salt and potato chips, or whether that's you being hooked on tobacco, whether that's you hooked on coffee, you're hooked on sugar. We get hooked on all sorts of things. Video games, phones, over and over and over. There's lots of addictions, and that's what everyone wants you. Facebook, in theory right now, has everyone addicted to anger and hate because they'll show them stuff that gets them riled up. They stay on the site longer. Facebook makes more money. Perverse incentives, downside of free markets. You get lots of financial scams. So in a free market, you can buy from Bernie Madoff and he can invest your money for you or steal it from you. Enron can make a bunch of bullshit supposed investments and seem like they're going crazy in the market, but meanwhile it's nonsense. You can get sold on pyramid schemes where the next thing you know, you're selling vitamins for some guy and you have a basement full of them and you don't remember how you even got there, but it seemed like a good idea at the time. Payday loan companies that extort people for hugely high interest rates and large fees and other nonsense that's not fair, essentially. But in a free market where you have free choice, people get to choose. It's a downside. Another downside is when companies go to profit maximization, which is a terrible word, and I think that anyone who's looking at the long term is not trying to maximize profits today. However, based off of the way that some CEOs are incentivized based on share price, they are trying to do profit maximization today, which is bad because profit maximization can destroy a company where you think you have value and also take advantage of people. So the one I put in here, an example of what about gas prices during hurricanes? And what you used to see is the gas prices get jacked up. Gas just went from $3 a gallon to $10 because, well, it's an emergency and I have some and you don't. So supply and demand economics in a free market say I can charge whatever I want. But you shouldn't take advantage of people when they're in a bad situation. It's the same problem I have with the healthcare system. Should we really be making money on people when they're sick? Putting them in debt where now they owe debt because they got sick? Tough. It's tough. So there's definitely downsides. This is the one where I think we have the biggest problem in the U.S. right now. We have large companies and super rich people, and they've got significant resources that they're allowed to push into politics and government and policy. Citizens United was a terrible decision for the citizens of the United States because it allowed big money to get into politics. And I think that one needs to be overturned by the Supreme Court, and we need to set limits and set how much a politician's allowed to receive instead of, each candidate for president should receive a set number and they should all get the same instead of it being you got a huge advantage because you're rich already. And then we end up with another crazy rich person in the White House, which isn't what we want. When government doesn't do its actual job of regulation, it protects vested interest and allows monopolies instead of protecting consumers and protecting free markets. As I already mentioned with corn, that's an easy one to do, right? It shows. But they've allowed all of the consolidation in industries, whether it's banking, where you've got a few big banks control so much that they're too big to fail. Well, too big to fail is just too big. That means the government hasn't done its job. Just regulate size. They're allowing monopolies. They shouldn't allow it to happen. There's the good side, which is you go, hey, we want some regulation in here to protect consumers. There's the downside when they protect the company instead of the consumer. instead of protecting the free market. And companies who have large amounts of resources, they want to maintain all the customers and keep growing and growing and growing. Government hasn't done its job. It's bad for free markets. And then governments create and support all sorts of crony capitalism. I put obesity in here because the food pyramid's made up by the government. The FDA puts out the food pyramid. Well, the food pyramid highly concentrates carbohydrates right now, which is terrible. That's why we're all obese. They keep telling us to eat more and more carbohydrates when we're not using the fuel. You don't need that. Sugar is highly addictive and should be regulated. I believe that sugar should have the same sign on it that cigarettes have. It causes cancer. It's bad for you. It will make you fat. But we don't put any restrictions on any of that. They're going to charge extra in tobacco. A pack of cigarettes probably costs 50 cents to make. They sell for $10 in New York City. Why? Oh, because it's bad for people, so we're going to take some money to offset the bad. Okay, well, why don't you do the same thing with all the other bad things? Instead, the sugar industry does all the research, nonsensical research, directed research with directed results that equal what we want them to, because otherwise we're not going to pay you for it. That's not a free market. That's crony capitalism. And then they go tell the FDA, hey, carbs are okay, fat's bad for you. It's not true. Inuit Indians eat 80% fat in their diet. They're not dying from heart attacks. It's not the fat. It's the fat combined with the sugar. That's the death. That's the bad one. Created by your government. You have them to thank. Opioid epidemic. Why in the world would we allow something so potent, so addictive to be given out to people all the time? Because of one bad paper, bad policy, that's it. And government refusing to do anything. So now what are they going to do? They allowed it to be legal. So the companies had a perverse incentive to, hey, if we get people hooked on it, we're going to make more money because we're going to sell more product. That's a duh. And now they're going to sue all the companies for doing the marketing to sell the product and pushing it out there. Come on. Where's the responsibility of the government? How come we're all not suing the FDA for making them legal to begin with, which got everybody hooked? And the statistics are staggering. If you renew your prescription once, your likelihood of addiction goes way up. If you renew your prescription twice, you're almost guaranteed to get addictive. That's how addictive these things are. We shouldn't have those out in society all over the place, but your government's allowing them. So that's a dark side of the free market. The market's no longer free and it's supposed to be regulated by your government, but it's not. So let's walk away from the political side of stuff and let's assume we have a free market and just discuss how does it work. So if I want to buy a vehicle in a free market, what are my options? Well, your options are pretty much infinite. You could buy a German car, BMW. You could buy a Japanese car, buy a Honda or Toyota. You could buy an American car, a Ford or GM. Now, whether or not any of those cars are assembled in any of those countries is a completely different story. But you can buy a car from an Italian company, a British one. You can buy a classic car. You can buy a restored car. You can buy whatever car you want to buy, you're allowed to buy. Driving, it's different, especially in California. You're not necessarily allowed to drive a car, any car anywhere. Sometimes you have to have, a car has to meet certain emissions restrictions that we've put in place, and that distorts the free market. If you go to buy a car, you can negotiate the price with the seller of the car. The seller doesn't have to sell you the car at that price. You're not compelled to buy. You can buy from a dealership. You can buy from a person. You can go to an auction. You can find somebody on Craigslist and go pay them cash. We have choice. We also get to choose how we finance it. It's not combined. So if you lived in a communist country, the options are what they allow them to be. So there's going to be restrictions on what cars are available. Even in non-communist countries, there's restrictions. For example, in Brazil, there's a huge tariff on imported cars because they're trying to prop up the local car companies. So that means you can buy from other companies from different countries, but they're very, very, very expensive. So can you negotiate price? Well, if everything's owned by the government, not really, only a little bit. So in America, the government's also made rules regarding sales to protect consumers. Like, for example, you're allowed to refinance a car at any time. There's lemon laws that say if your car doesn't work, then you're allowed to take it back, and they have to take it back. Those are good things that protect consumers, and they need to be there in markets that are mature and where people are spending a whole lot of money. So you will see usually the higher ticket price the item, the more government controls are in place. So housing and cars, those are the two where people spend the most amount of money. Those ones are pretty regulated by the government to make sure that consumers aren't getting extremely damaged and taken advantage of. But there's the dark side of the free market as well that we have to acknowledge. That comes with the whole caveat emptor, buyer beware. You can get sold a lemon, whether you're buying a new or a used one, or you can get sold something that costs more than you can really afford. You can get sold on financing that costs you more than it should. You can get sold on buying a car that you really didn't even want. That's available. You can be sold. We already discussed the financing. There's also no guarantee that anybody's going to buy that car from you in the future. So let's say, for example, you bought a VW that was part of that diesel scandal. Okay, now maybe you can't sell that to anybody because everybody knows, oh, that diesel's nonsense and it's not going to pass emissions, so it's useless. Now, to try and protect consumers, they made them buy those cars back. But let's say you were in a state that didn't require that, and now you drive into a state that does require emissions. Now, all of a sudden, you can't sell your car because no one's allowed to buy it, or no one's allowed to. People are allowed to buy it. They're just not allowed to drive it. You can't get it registered, but you can own it. So if you have private property, you can run it there because that's not on public streets, not required to be registered. Short of that, you might not be able to sell it. There's no guarantee you'll be able to sell it for a certain price. There's just no guarantees. That's what a free market says. No one has to buy. If it's free and no one has to buy from you, then there's no guarantee you get to sell that car. However, we know that most assets are buyable and sellable. So let's shift our economic discussion over to how it really works and how pricing is set in a free market. And that's based on supply and demand. So how does supply and demand work when you're going to sell your car? So if you're going to buy the car or sell the car, you get to go do your own research. You get to decide what kind of price you want to hold or what you're willing to sell it for, and you get to decide who you sell it to. And if you own a car dealership, then there's going to be more restrictions placed upon you in terms of not wanting to sell to certain people, but pretty much you could sell your car to whoever you want. You could sell your car to a dealership. You could sell it to a family member. You could sell it private party. You can give it to charity. You have all these options that a free market allows you. Price is determined based on how many people want to buy your vehicle. So if you've got something where tastes have changed and nobody wants your car, then it's not worth very much. Or if you bought a car and tastes have changed and everybody wants your car because there's not very many available, like, for example, I just saw an article where they said because certain cars were used in movies, now people want those cars, even though there was no other reason that they wanted them before, but now all of a sudden they're a collector's item. Collectors get to decide what they want to collect and what's a collector's item, not the rest of us. If you've got a custom car, an antique car, you can sell it for as much as you want. A free market says that there is no lid on the price. That if people are willing to pay you millions of dollars for a car that you bought, great. Jay Leno's famous for investing in cars and has lots of them, and most of them are worth way more money than he paid for them. But at the same token, they could become worth less if nobody wants to buy them. So if you would try to sell your car and it's not a free market, you'd have limits. Either high tariffs if you were trying to sell it into a different country, or you might have high tariffs if you're trying to buy when you're trying to pick out the car that you want to buy. Now, most people think that in America we don't have that many tariffs on cars. On cars, we don't have a lot of tariffs. On trucks, we have tariffs, known as the chicken tax, part of a chicken tax bill that they stacked on for no apparent reason except for, the usual of government. Why be clear and just do one thing when you could be muddy and do four poorly? So you won't find countries importing many trucks into the United States. So in the United States, the reason that the domestic truck manufacturers have the majority of the market is because they're protected by tariffs. And so the companies that are selling here, when you see Toyota trucks they're typically assembled in America. And that plant's in America because if you assemble that truck somewhere else, bring it into America, you're going to pay a high tariff, which means no one's going to buy it because it's too expensive. Every time you're in a foreign country and you see those Toyota Helios trucks, you're like, oh, this is a nice truck. How come I can't get this in America? That's why, because there's tariffs. Not exactly a free market. You may also have limited options to sell if you're not in a free market. You may be required to sell it at a dealership, and it may be at set prices by the government instead of set by the free economics of supply and demand by the free market. And governments can decide at any time what you're allowed to sell. So in China, for example, they're pushing electric cars. So if you're not selling an electric car, they can decide that it's going to cost you more. And in fact, or they could tell you you can't buy a car at all. They may decide who gets to own a car and who doesn't. In a free market, any of us can go buy whatever we want. So let's talk about how government tweaks supply and demand. We've mentioned some of these things that, they're gonna make tariffs, but if a government continues to allow monopolies in many markets, we know we've got a bunch of them. 3 cell phone companies is what we're going to be left with. That's not really a free market. 1 or 2 cable and internet providers, usually which provide the worst service, and they're fighting cities trying to take back their own control of their own internet. That's government creating and altering supply and demand and allowing monopolies to exist. Bad laws for supply and demand of student loans. You can't discharge a loan in bankruptcy. Why not? Because the government made the law, which means it's no longer set by market forces. So if market forces were in charge of student loan debt, we wouldn't have a student loan debt crisis because no private citizens or banks would loan somebody $100,000 to get a degree in sociology. So the government said that in this opportunity to give everybody a shot, we are going to restrict the bankruptcy and make it non-dischargeable. Well, that's a huge problem. That's no longer a free market. And now we've got a student loan debt crisis. Thanks to your government. And that's not to say that I don't agree that everyone should be given an opportunity, but there should be limits and there should be controls over that. And there's not. And our government hasn't done a good job with that and usually doesn't. The FDA allowed opiates to be prescribed. Now we've got that crisis. Already talked about that a bit. Different industries where rules are protecting them from competition. Corn for ethanol. Hemp. We used to pay people in this country to grow hemp to make rope during World War II. Hemp is useful for all sorts of different things. And we're talking about hemp, non-psychoactive THC. We'll get to the drugs here in a minute, to the illegal drugs, because we obviously know we've got problems with the legal ones. We've got an opioid epidemic. No one says we have a weed epidemic where people are dying from weed, although Mexican cartels are poisoning people with poison in weed, that they're growing them because the market's illegal. But for now, let's stick to this one. So when you've got a lot of vested interests that don't want something legal, they get together and the government creates laws against it. So you've got cotton people who don't want to use hemp paper, despite the fact that our Constitution's written on hemp paper. Well, cotton people don't want them to use that or cotton's more for clothing. You don't want to use hemp for clothing because it'll last longer. The timber industry is who doesn't want it for paper. And that's a vested interest, right? You've got all of the pharmaceutical companies who don't want CBD and THC CBD legal for pain medicine because they'd rather sell people, opioids that they get addicted to. So you've got a lot of interests here that want nothing to do with it. The corn people don't want hemp legal because as a biofuel, it would be much more beneficial than growing corn. It just is what it is. So it's government creating. So these subsidies, like I said, keep farmers growing stuff that's not good for us. So what are we growing is what's subsidized. We're growing corn and soy and wheat, heavily subsidized by the government, and that's put more and more into our diets, and we're all getting fat. Wonder why. Laws of morality created by the government, whether it's drugs, prostitution, gambling, they've changed the supply and demand curve of this. And that means that organized crime gets billions in profits. So you can morally believe that prostitution's bad, but by making it illegal, We just push it underground. It doesn't mean that there's really less of it happening. The fear that we all have is that if all of a sudden we made prostitution legal, that everyone would want to go get prostitutes all the time. But in places where it is legal, that's not what's happened. It's the same thing with drugs. Just because you can decriminalize heroin does not mean everybody wants to go do heroin. People don't want to do it. And some of the science that they give us is this bullshit science left over from one rat by itself in a cocaine tube. Yeah, by itself, that rat wants cocaine because it wants to change its state because it's not happy. But put in a nice rat village where it's got other rats to hang out with and be cool with, turns out they don't want to be high all the time. People are the same. While we seek state change, we don't necessarily want to be messed up all the time. So when you create laws of morality, you make it hard for police, really hard. The reason that cops have the worst job in America is because they're supposed to enforce laws of morality. The second thing is it doesn't protect anybody. When you make prostitution illegal, that's going to increase human trafficking. Because if you go over to Amsterdam, where prostitution is legal, they have social workers who go around and check in with the prostitutes, make sure they don't have pimps, make sure they've been tested and they're clean, make sure that no one's taking all of their money. Can't do that when it's illegal and underground. Same thing with gambling. And then we come to find out that more and more police are involved in these setups of prostitution rings and gambling rings, protecting them. So when the criminals and the police both agree that something should be illegal, it's because they both have a vested interest. Cops are trying to keep their jobs. Hey, the more stuff that's illegal, the more stuff we have to enforce, the more cops we need. And meanwhile, the drug dealers are like, yeah, keep it illegal. That means I get to keep my price high and make a lot of profits, and they have a lot of money. And we see the gangs running all of Central America, where citizens are frightened. The reason that we have all of these immigrants trying to reach America is because they're in countries torn apart by a drug war that we've created by making all these drugs illegal. So your government skews the supply and demand. Billions in profits go to criminal activities. This is how Al Capone got rich. We started this in America in the 1920s. We haven't learned our lessons yet. Prohibition does not work. People are going to do what they want to do regardless. And telling people something is right or wrong because you believe it is also bad. It just doesn't work. It's never worked. It never will work. And so we can continue to fight ourselves. And instead, what do we have? We've got a lot of people in prison that shouldn't be in prison. Because over what? A bunch of drugs that people shouldn't have been arrested for to begin with. Meanwhile, in the back end of that, Kill the Messenger shows that the CIA had a whole lot to do with bringing a lot of drugs into the United States. So your government makes it illegal and then is complicit in bringing them in? Terrible. And it also supports racism in the court system. 80% of the people who use cocaine are white. 80% of the people who are in jail for cocaine are not white. Staggering statistics from your government skewing supply and demand. So what should government's role be? In a free society, we need rules that protect free markets and consumers. Accountability and transparency is the key to oversight. We should all be able to understand the rules and the enforcement. When the IRS has laws that are so complex, we're required to hire CPAs and lawyers to decipher them for us. This is because there's vested interest in getting carve-outs. There's subsidies and credits and deductions and all of these games that are being played because crony capitalism exists. They shouldn't. It should be easy for everybody to understand. Instead, according to my lawyers, we're all felons every day. It's just which laws they choose to enforce. There's so many laws that nobody could possibly know them all. And yet, not knowing the laws is not a defense for violating one. It makes no sense. We've got way too many. So government should shrink the amount of laws that they have so that we're protecting free markets and consumers. Companies should have a limited ability to influence politics. In my mind, they should be able to spend zero. Nothing. Why? Now, that's not to say that companies shouldn't have some availability for lobbying, because it is important for the lawmakers to understand the perspective of industry and to understand the ramifications of the laws that they're proposing and how those might impact their constituents and free markets and society. But that's a short balance, and realistically that should be a very controlled space. And that's why I say limited, not zero. They should protect free markets and the opportunity for free competition. That means you don't allow Facebook to buy Instagram. You don't. You don't allow them to buy anybody else. You don't allow T-Mobile and Sprint to merge so we can end up with 3 companies. That's terrible. We need more competition, not less. And one way to get rid of competition is just buy up all the competitors, and then you have a monopoly. And then what happens? Prices get raised, service goes to shit. Same old story. We've been through this in the U.S. before, where the trust busters had to come in and break up the companies because they'd gotten so huge. Now we've let them all get huge again. And again, too big to fail, simply too big. Makes no sense. Just limit size. Monopolies and oligopolies are horrible for consumers and free markets. They're bad for choice, bad for prices. Like I said, too big to fail is just too big. We could limit size just based on size. You could do it on a sales number. You could do it on an employee number. There's lots of ways to limit size. Market share, all of those things should be considered. But right now, they're not limiting pretty much anything. The government should only create restrictions when necessary. You shouldn't need a license to braid hair, but consumers should know when products are addictive. It's as simple as it sounds. We've put licensing requirements on all sorts of things because the people that decided to open up a shop and rent to braid hair don't want you to go over to somebody's house and not have to pay rent because you just know them and braid hair. No, that's illegal. You have to have a license to do that. You should only need a license for very few professional services. Very few. Instead, the list has gotten longer and longer and longer. And most of those restrictions are just getting into the profession. The requirements going forward are usually very, very minimal and hardly audited at all and checked. So it's the barrier to get over. And this is often the story for a lot of people and how a lot of people view it. It's, I want the fence to be low so that I can get over it, so that I can be included in the group. But then once I'm included in the group, let's raise the fence really high so that we exclude everyone else so we can all raise our prices and there's a limited amount of supply based on the demand and we all make more money. But that's not a free market, and that's bad. And that's, again, getting money into politics and government, and that's crony capitalism. The last thing, government needs to stop subsidizing industries we don't need. Corn for fuel is bad for everybody. It's bad for our environment. It's bad for consumer because now instead of those farmers growing other crops that we actually want to eat, they're just continuing to growing corn that we don't even want in our fuel. So simple as it should be. So the government's role should be straightforward. But it's also very complicated. And I don't like to rail on government too much because the fundamental system of how it's done in this country is difficult. And what I mean by that is, once government creates a law, there aren't mechanisms in place to come back in, say, 10, 15, 20, even 50 years and say, do we still need this? Do we still need this agency? Do we still need these rules? Is this still applicable today? And Airbnb is a really good example of this because there's a lot of pieces of this that are good and bad. So free market rules say I can rent my house to whoever I want to, whenever I want, for whatever price I want to charge, as long as the consumer is willing to pay. That's an efficient allocation of resources. That gives flexibility to the consumer for a better experience for a hotel. That gives flexibility to people who own personal property to make some more money off it and use it. That increases the value of the property when I sell it because it has rental income value in addition to me living in it value. But it creates tough choices for governments because while homeless population has gone up in California, nobody wants to really admit that Airbnb's got something to do with it, but it does. And here's why. If a price of a home is based on the revenue that home can bring in, and I've changed that model from it being a monthly rental to being a daily rental, and I can make more with the daily rental than the monthly rental, then the price of the home is now based off the daily rental, not the monthly rental, which means home prices increase because I can rent it out day by day. And so prices have gone up because Airbnb exists. And what happened? People went around and people got real smart and did the math real quick and went, oh, wait a minute. I can make a lot more money doing it, renting it out for Airbnb than I can make renting it to monthly renters. So I'm going to get rid of the monthly renters and do the nightly rental. And that also makes my property more valuable when I go to sell it. And that's one of the reasons property values have increased, is because the utilization of that property and the value proposition has increased. And this creates a tough choice for government. So what happens when there's not enough residents for housing? Not enough housing for residents in a particular town. So Boulder, Colorado is a perfect example of this. Because Boulder put strict limitations on growth and open space requirements, effectively they've limited supply. But demand's not short, so that's raised prices extremely high. A starter house in Boulder will probably cost you $1 million. So if you work for the county of Boulder, if you're a teacher in Boulder, you can't afford to live in Boulder on what they pay you on a teacher's salary. And so the communities haven't done their job of saying, hey, we're going to protect the jobs that we need in our community with housing that those people can afford to live in. And so there's no affordable housing in Boulder. So all the people that work for the city of Boulder, for the most part, none of them live in Boulder, which is really strange. So then you also have the question is, okay, if you switch to the Airbnb model immediately, are you collecting enough sales tax and occupancy taxes that provides all of the other services that go into having guests in your community? And Airbnb is now, to their credit, doing a lot of this for you. So regardless of where you live, Airbnb has figured out what they want collected and what's required. And they're collecting it all for you and remitting it to the city, which is the only reason their business model is going to continue to work. Because if everybody had to do that individually, that's pretty hard. And there's other platforms that have been around longer in doing this, but those were more specific to specific markets. So the question for government becomes, what's the right law to protect personal property rights but not create a housing shortage? So in cities like Denver, they said, okay, you're allowed as an individual to have one Airbnb rental. And now they're trying to restrict that even more to say, hey, let's go back to the premise of Airbnb, which is I have extra rooms in my house not to rent, not the whole property. And therefore, I'm the primary owner of that property. I live there and I can make a little bit extra with me living there versus just buying properties to rent on a nightly basis, i.e. becoming a boutique hotel with a certain number of rooms. So a lot of the current problems we have were previous solutions. And this is kind of a theme when it comes to government. And again, go back to the idea that there's no system set up so that you can review a government law or policy X number of years in. It basically has to be brought up by the current politicians. There's no automatic mechanism in place to say, hey, we're going to limit people to have one Airbnb, and this law is going to be in place for 5 or 10 years, and then we're going to come back and look at it and see if it still makes sense. Because what happens if a bunch of people decide to leave Colorado, and we have all of these empty apartments that could be used as hotel rooms, but instead that's not allowed, so we keep building hotels. Now we have apartments that aren't being used and too many hotels that aren't really being used right. Well, you end up with too much. Tough decisions. It is what it is. So in some areas, rental properties were the norm, right? If you go to Hawaii or you go to Vail, Colorado, almost every property in the whole entire city is a rental property. Or in Hawaii, anything that's on the coast has become a rental property. And a lot of people are interested in that model, and that's made it really expensive for the locals. So the local Hawaiians are getting priced out of their own land because it's so expensive. And Hawaii is not the only place this happens to. This happens in Belize, where you've got expats from multiple different countries going down there. It's happening in Costa Rica. It happens all over the world where people from, we'll call it rich nations, move to poorer nations. And because of the economic value, you could say, that they bring, they come in and they take over. And the locals are left without much. And that's a tough situation that we end up in. And There's not an easy answer for that. If we say the prices in a community have reached such, like Boulder, where the people who work in the community can't live in the community, that's a problem. And California's got this in droves. How are you supposed to be a teacher in Silicon Valley, where a house is $1 million plus? So what does that mean? We're going to have fewer and fewer teachers there, or all those teachers have to go to private schools to make enough money, and the price of private school means that if you want an education in Silicon Valley, you got to be rich. That's a problem. That's a problem we have in our schools all over the place. So these are tough government questions that conflict with free market principles. That's what I'm saying. It's not a right answer. It's tough. It's tough to decide. How should we treat Airbnb? It's not a simple thing. And then you have government's reluctance to change. And this is what I was talking about with there's no requirement that government come back and look at it. What often happens in government agencies is, and this is how we ended up with the war on drugs, by the way. There's a book called Chasing the Scream, if you're interested to learn about how one sort of crazy government employee who wanted to expand his government agency ended up expanding drug laws to the extent that they are today. It's a good read. It's quite fascinating into the inner workings of how government works. But anytime we have to change a law, you have people who don't want the law to change, and you have people who want the law to change. And someone's going to scream every time. So you can't keep everybody happy. And you got to try and do what's right for the majority of people. But with no systems in place to require governments come back and look at laws, we end up with a bunch of bad laws on the books that continue because no one wants to put up the fight to change them. And there's no mechanism to require that change. And this is why these things are difficult. How do we balance Airbnb with protecting your personal rights and free markets with, hey, if we just allow this to grow rampant, then we have basically all these little hotels, which we thought we had hotels in a specific district, or we had permits for hotels, but now any house can be turned into a mini hotel, and people can do multiples of those across the city, and now there's no housing for residents. And that's bad for a city too. So what's the balance of that? And how does that balance change over time? Maybe up front, there's a recognition that, hey, today we're not set up. There's not enough housing to do both of these. So we need more restrictions. But how about in 5 or 10 years? Is that still the case? Should it be looked at again? And there's not a lot of incentive for government to do that. And there's no mechanisms in place to do that. And that makes it difficult. So this gets us to the end of our presentation here, and the end of this, it's not the end of this discussion. It's certainly the beginning of this discussion, but hopefully this gives everybody some things to think about of A, why free markets are great and good and necessary, and B, some of the difficulty with government regulating them and what the side effects of government decisions can be. And hopefully everyone sees that free markets are really good for the consumer. They're good for us as entrepreneurs and for the creativity and the incentive to make things better for everybody. And that incentive has made America the greatest country on the planet. That's the reason we have the biggest economic engine, is because we have the greatest amount of creativity, because we have the least amount of government oversight intervention, and the closest thing to a free market. But we could still do better. So hopefully you got something out of this. We'll continue this free market discussion as it relates to other things in the future. And I think there's still some more things here to explore, but hopefully this gave you some insights into why free markets are important and why we need to keep them free. Thanks for listening. Catch you next time.